Heather giving our talk about packaging and what happens if I delete my setup file. So thank you.
All right. That's not terrible, is it? All right. All right, well, hello. My name is Heather. Other than my mother and my employer, most people call me Weasel, but we also happen to be at my employer's office, so I will answer to both for the evening. My talk is called What Happens If I Delete setup.py. So I'd like to talk about packaging. Before I do that, I'd like to just make a few things clear. Packaging is a really broad topic, and a lot of people find it either overwhelming or have a lot of serious opinions on the subject. There are a lot of ways to package software. Python does it in a way that's developer-centric, giving you more options, fine-grained control, ideally, also a number of ways to cause problems. Packaging tools in and of themselves are a very broad topic. I'm not going to tell you how to set up poetry or how to migrate an existing project to a new project management tool. I'm going to focus on how do we build a package. And finally, to touch on the opinionated point, we work in software, and quite frankly, stable is a synonym for slowly rotting. So you cut a new tag, you're not doing any new features on that, but you're still going to have open CVEs filed against your dependencies, your operating system, the language you're working in, what have you. Python packaging in and of itself has changed a lot. Yeah. So best practice is more of an evolving concept and not a thing you learned and consider a given. So with that, let's look at a brief history of Python packaging. distutils was introduced in Python 2.0, which was released in October 2.0. It first introduced the cadence from distutils import setup, created the idea of setup.py. It was then deprecated in 3.10 and 2 releases later removed in Python 3.12. Setuptools came around in 2004 as an enhancement for distutils. The idea being you can provide all the necessary tools to build and upload a project in one library. Setuptools, of course, is still around, although a lot of this functionality has been replaced by other packages. Case in point, upload, which didn't support HTTPS, was deprecated in 2013. Pip, who's used Pip? That came around in 2011. It's had a lot of interesting improvements since then. I'm saying that as someone who used Pip circa 2011. And then finally, in 2015, we had PEP 5.17, and in 2016, PEP 5.18, which basically set a spec and created the way for new style packaging. Key points of this: one of these PEPs separated the build system dependencies from runtime dependencies, defined an API in order which to do that. The second one specified the guidelines for pyproject.toml. So what do we mean when we talk about new style packaging? So there's this minimal API, build wheel, build sdist. We can separate, you also had an intermediary thing called setup.config, which came along in 2019, but later got absorbed by pyproject.toml, allowing you to separate build metadata from package metadata. We're going to look at all this shortly. But I guess I'd like to make clear, why do you want to use an alternate build system? maybe you care about isolating your build tools from your runtime tools. The biggest reason I get error, the biggest thing I can think of as an example of that is cryptography and packages that use Rust. Maybe you find these things better or easier to use. Maybe you just want to, or maybe you don't want to. Setuptools also supports new style packaging, and you can continue to use setuptools as your build backend if you want. Helps if I use the right key. All right, so with that, I have a bunch of live demos. First, it's easy to talk about this stuff, but let's look at some actual code. I'm going to start with, let's look at setup.py for twisted, setup.config, and finally pyproject.toml. All right, so we're starting with 17.1.0, which was 8 years ago. So how many people have written a setup.py script? All right. So you know we have this setup method that it has to call. Oh, in Biggin. Oh, geez.
I saw you use Hatch for your build system. Like, what influenced your choice for using that? Just curious.
I'm going to take this off now that I'm done with the live demo. Thanks. All right. So Hatch is what Twisted uses. And I mean, I work on Twisted every now and again, but I also just, regardless of whether you like their event loop versus async IOs, they're a very well-managed project. And they use Hatch. And so if it comes down to like, how do you manage like contributors to open source things? How do you manage packaging, various things? I generally look to them because it's probably the best example I've had just professionally. But yeah, I mean, your mileage may vary. If you like other build systems, use them for sure. Over setup, it's implementing that API, that the two methods, the build sdist and build wheel, but it's doing it as a different backend. And I don't know, you know, sometimes it's nice to try new things, but.
So you could just make something that implements the API and it, instead of actually any other spec, right?
So those two PEPs I mentioned, 517 and 518. Yeah, 517 specifies here's a minimal API that, you know, you have to follow if you're going to build a Python packaging system. And so, yeah. After that, you know, you have Flit, you have PDM, you have hatchling. Of course, you have like PDM is also a project management tool to like manage your package dependencies and whatever, like during your regular workflow. Hatch is like the counterpart to that, with the build backend being called hatchling. Poetry, a lot of people know about poetry. Yeah, I mean, there's like there's a spec, and as long as you follow the spec, you can implement whatever tools you want to do this now.
It is somebody who, you know, the nature of my project work, once every few years, I'm diving into setup, you know, the setup stuff. And, you know, you go back to that was the how-to that you were working from, the packaging how-to. Is that kind of the yes. And that's kind of the reference. And but just as kind of a casual, more of a casual user from the setup point of view, it seems like every time I do a pip install, it wants to like advance pips version, advance setup tools versions, and those versions are moving forward like really, really fast. And so I'm wondering, you know, conceptually is that maturity? Is that new concepts coming out? Is that better methods, or you know, how do I interpret those fast advances, or is it just my perception?
All right, I think there's a number of things at work here, and it's not that they're changing the API so quickly, but I know that there's definitely been a ton of work around supply chain security in recent years. Naomi, you might know more about this than I do, but all the work that's been going on about supply chain security for Python, there have been talks about it the last 2 PyCons in a row, but things to secure, for instance, PyPA against typo squatting, malicious uploaders, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff going on with that. And I would say probably the increased cadence of releases on these things has a lot to do with that. Thank you.